Bienvenido a todos. Gracias por venir hoy para nuestra ponencia magistral por la doctora Maia Dedrick. Antes de comenzar, mientras que nos reunimos en una plataforma virtual, nos gustaría reconocer la importancia de la tierra que cada uno llama hogar. De costa a costa reconocemos humildemente el territorio ancestral y eternal del Inuit, Métis y personas de las primeras naciones que llaman hogar a esta tierra. So hello, everybody. Welcome to our keynote address to start off our 2023-2024 year here at CLAAS. Today we have Dr. Maia Dedrick, who will be delivering our keynote address. But before we get started, while we meet in a virtual platform, we would like to acknowledge the importance of the land which we all call home. From coast to coast, we respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation peoples that call this land home. I'd now like to pass the torch to Dr. Patricia Aparicio to introduce Dr. Maia Dedrick today.
Thank you, Alexa. Maia Dedrick got her PhD in anthropology at University of North Carolina in 2019. She is assistant professor at Santa Clara University. She uses paleoethnobotany, among other archaeological techniques, to study food systems, climate change, and colonialism, predominantly in Yucatan, Mexico. Today, she will be presenting her talk titled Community Engaged Climate Adaptation Research in Yucatan, Mexico. Thanks, Maia, for being here with us, and you can start.
Great, thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction. I do want to thank Patricia in particular for setting up the scheduling. So thank you so much for that. And in general, I'm very excited to learn more about the society and how you are disseminating information to the public about this kind of research. And in general, just the wide array of activities you have going on. It's been great getting to know. So today, I do want to tell you about my most recent research project that's still in the works. I'm going to first, let me change my slide here. Start, however, with a bit of information about my general research approach that I think might make this talk a little bit more relevant to everyone watching today. So I really had that in mind when I shaped the form of this talk. And then I want to give you some context and background in terms of the regional presence of this project, as well as the project history itself. And then I would like to get into the nitty-gritty of the project I'm currently working on agricultural adaptations to climate change. So to start with, going to foreground something that might be a little uncomfortable for many of us, but in Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, as in many places around the world, there is a pretty long history of imperial archaeology taking place in this area, specifically by archaeologists from the United States and Canada. So I wanted to foreground that, and I wanted to introduce a couple of specific examples. At Chichen Itza, in particular, there is a sacred cenote, and that was dredged in the early 20th century by Edward H. Thompson. And he claimed those artifacts as Harvard, sent them to the Peabody Museum at Harvard, basically not through legal means. And that was basically theft, right, of these artifacts from Mexico. As another example, U.S. imperialism in the region, archaeologist Sylvanus G. Morley was actually a spy, acting as a spy as he was doing archaeology in this region of the northern Yucatan Peninsula. And I'm taking these images from an open access publication, an article for the Mayanist journal. And so the reason why these particular works of art by Walter Paz Ho were included in that piece is because Sylvanus G. Morley, yes, was an archaeologist, was also a spy, and to point out that the interpretations of the archaeological evidence that he made were also colored by that perspective of being a spy on his particular personal and nationalistic politics. I think this needs to be foregrounded for a variety of reasons, one of which is actually that these are kinds of histories that I run into regularly when I'm doing my fieldwork. And it's not just from because I'm looking at books that have problematic statements in them, but it's also from the people who I work with, the people who I run into, including people who live in towns across Yucatan. There is now a vibrant network of universities that are considered intercultural or similar to them, serving students who may speak Yucatec Mayan language as their first language. And these kinds of histories of imperialism are really integral to the education when encouraging students to embrace their heritage, to take control of their heritage, and see why that hasn't been kind of facilitated in the past, I'll say. So because of that, these students go back and teach their parents about what they've learned. And sometimes someone in a family who I run into will say, oh, well, Edward H. Thompson just stole all of the artifacts, from Chichen Itza. And so why should we expect that you won't do the same? Another example would be going to an archaeological conference where someone will casually, an archaeologist based in the area will casually say, well, part of the problem with the archaeological research here is that there are too many foreigners involved in the work. And so I just think that it's been good for me to have these perspectives come to me as a framing aspect of my work. And that's why I offer that to all of you today, to just consider these kinds of dynamics and what that means for the kind of work that is ethical to do. So one other piece that I included in the Maia article that I wanted to highlight for you all today is something I find useful is when I'm considering an archaeological project and trying to understand the path that it took, is to ask myself, what motivated this study? And I think that as archaeologists, such as myself, I have kind of the privilege of looking forward to a career in archaeology, which is not true of everyone. I acknowledge that it's my responsibility to not just seek out career advancement, not just seek out the advancement of the discipline, but to find ways to redress the imperialist past that I was just outlining. And so let me introduce this slide a little bit more. So on this slide, you'll see different motivations that have existed for research and continue to exist to some extent in some cases. So you see imperialism, colonialism, basically control of other people's lands. And then you have nationalist in brackets, because a peer reviewer in this piece pointed out to me that nationalism doesn't quite fall into the same category necessarily, because it, in many cases, pushing back against imperialism and colonial past. So you have a nationalistic archaeology that's seeking to create space where it has been denied before. I had already mentioned career advancement. I'd already mentioned espionage. Hopefully, none of us are stuck in the conundrum of that being a motivation. Advancing the discipline, of course, through educating students, that's all part of it. I'm not saying that these are bad motivations by any means altogether. And then along the bottom, I hope that many of us find personal enjoyment in this work. And I think it's great to have the public engaged in the kind of work we're doing and to disseminate knowledge, especially when tied to one of those two boxes in the bottom left, the purple being justice and sovereignty and pink being solidarity and advocacy. And how I'm differentiating these in my conception is that justice and sovereignty is related to people studying their own heritage and taking control over it when that might not have been possible before. And solidarity and advocacy, I mean working with group perhaps that one does not identify with, and doing one's best to open up space for heritage claiming in a group that may have been disenfranchised from it in the past. So from my perspective, as someone in the position that I am, I find that the solidarity and advocacy kind of motivation needs to be really highlighted in the work that I do for it to be ethical work. see, I think that's what I wanted to say here. So I'm going to move on. So if we want to do archaeology different from the imperial model, I hope we all have many diverse ideas about what that would entail. I'm going to put some very basic guidelines out there that can be more complicated than they sound. So in my case, I need to comply with Mexican laws and guidelines. And I think it's really important to partner with scholars based in the region, seeing as that I am not based in the region and I don't have even family in the region, for example. And then, as I was just mentioning, working in solidarity with people whose heritage is under study, so to speak, is being considered. So I've put a couple of pictures of the museum that is kind of foreshadow what I'm going to talk about a little bit. But I just want to acknowledge that these seem like straightforward steps, but sometimes if an archaeology law is really focused on protecting the nation and not communities that have been disenfranchised in that nation, but you're trying to work in solidarity with people who are whose heritage has been disenfranchised or dispossessed, then I think there can be tensions in this. And I think that a lot of times scholars based in the region who have that kind of historical contextual background will understand some of those, the balancing act that gets done, and that's another reason to work with them. Another general approach aspect of my work, really interested in the idea of decolonizing studies of tropical agriculture. I would say much like the history of archaeology, in some tropical areas, studies of agriculture have really been guilty of bringing in foreign perspectives and kind of overriding local knowledges and making it difficult to understand them on the terms of the deep knowledge held locally. And also by Indigenous peoples. And I use the term decolonizing. I acknowledge Tuck and Ying's article with the title, Decolonization is not a metaphor. And I think that there's possibilities here for this to actually, in working in solidarity, contribute to notions or contribute to actual land maintenance, to work against dispossession of land for Indigenous people. So that's why I'm using that term. And finally, I just wanted to point out as an example that someone coming from outside and not understanding the landscape of Swidden agriculture in Yucatan well could easily think, wow, there's so much forest, why isn't farming happening here? When in fact, there's a very detailed cycle of regrowth, and each stage has a name in Yucatec Mayan language and can produce certain kinds of useful plants and animals for human use, but also there's ecosystem functions there, and the soil is an important part of this cycle. So just as one quick example, and one way to decolonize studies of tropical agriculture then would be to speak with the experts who are people who have farmed for decades. But I'm actually going to interrupt myself here really briefly to bring in this important quote from Max Lebrun, who's at Métis, in the book Pollution is Colonialism. And I found this book very influential to my thinking, something I'm grappling with. And so I'm going to present a lot of ideas in this talk to which I don't have responses or answers. And I want to think with the lovely people in this society about the ways to move forward and create new paths. So this quote says, imperialism and colonialism both involve the scientific appropriation of local and Indigenous knowledges, eaten up and digested to create dominant scientific knowledge, unquote. So when I say it's really important to talk to Indigenous people about their agricultural knowledge, for example, I think it's also important to pause for a moment and say, okay, yes, but there needs to be space there, not to claim that knowledge, not to roll it into one's own studies, but for it to stand on its own, for it to be cited according to the people to whom it belongs. And I think this is really tricky for academia, because we're kind of set up to be extractive, and especially field sciences, we're set up to go out and come back with knowledge, even if we're no longer coming back necessarily with artifacts, and sometimes samples. So this is something I'm still grappling with, and I hope you'll all join me in that kind of journey. Finally, I'm not going to talk so much about my research in colonialism today, but I'm really interested in seeing, I'm interested, of course, in archaeology as a historically imperial kind of discipline, or at least colonial. And then also, but how did colonialism shape food systems today? And how did some of the structural violence change the possible and potential outcomes in an area? So basically, how did we get to how we are today, how the system is today? How is that based in some of the earlier legislation, reforms, initiatives that did cause loss of land? And another opportunity to understand the past to better shape the future. So now I'd like to move into some background on this project. Those of you who may have seen me talk before have probably heard me talk about sinkholes. Sinkholes in Yucatan are solution sinkholes in the limestone bedrock, and they can take a number of shapes. So here on the right, you have what's called a rejollada or coop in Yucatec Mayan language. They can be called dolines in English, and they're basically sunk in areas that have not reached the water table. So they are relatively shallow, although they can be down to the water table in this area, could be as deep as 15 to 20 meters, and then it would get swampy at the bottom. And there are places where then soil can collect, water can come up through capillary action, and so they're wonderful places for horticulture. On the left, we have cenotes. Those are sinkholes that have indeed reached the water table. They're very famous in Yucatan. Cenote comes from the Yucatec Mayan word tonot. And they can be kind of cylindrical. They can open up from caves. There can be water at the bottom of caves, and then that is defined as a cenote in local terminology. And then they can have rock shelters around the side. So there are diverse features with many uses. And I want to show you where in the peninsula they predominantly occur. They are all over the peninsula, these rejolladas, the shallow sinkholes. But here you see a zone where they are particularly dominant, and Scott Feddick mapped that zone. What is really cool about this is that one explanation for why there's so many rejolladas in the zone is because of the Chicxulub meteor strike and the crater that was formed, and all of the fissures in the bedrock, all the fissures in the limestone that then could continue to be chemically dissolved to create these features. So that's why there's a ring of cenotes that reach the water table, and then this kind of zone as well of the shallower features. So now I'm going to zoom in to this particular zone in the peninsula, really northeastern side here, on the Yucatan state side of the border, to a town of Tahcabo near the city of Tizimín. So now I'd like to tell you about the archaeological project that where we have primarily worked in Tahcabo for about 10 years now. This project began as a partnership between the Universidad de Oriente in Valladolid, Yucatan, which is just under an hour's drive to Tahcabo, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And specifically between Patricia McInerney and Ivan Batun-Alpuche, professors at each of those institutions. And so I've, in recent years, kind of stepped into a co-PI role with them. So this project has really, UNO, or the Universidad de Oriente, has been really important in this project. Students from different programs have worked with us throughout the years. Many of them come from towns similar to that where we work, and kind of bring perspective, comparative perspective to their own experiences. Many of them bring Yucatec Mayan language as a real skill to the project and asset to the project. And this project was formed, it says on the slide, in 2012. And at that point, we were visiting towns across the peninsula in order to look for members of communities, residents of towns who would be interested in working with us on something that we could envision together, some kind of archaeological project that would accrue benefit to them as well. And they were also interested in, what does the archaeology look like here, whether those are the churches, the colonial buildings, what open spaces exist where things may have preserved, etc. And so within a couple of years, we ended up deciding to work in Tahcabo. And so I was asked for this presentation to discuss some of the community engagement that really is the foundation of this work. And so I'm going to include this piece on the photo voice project I did way back in 2014. It was an early component of this project. And the idea for this project was to understand people's conceptions of heritage, what they love about their town, things that maybe could stand to change. But really kind of starting with the assets and the wonderful things about Tahcabo, because people look at their hometown, in this case, very fondly. So this particular project, I was working with 6 students who were then in secondary school, and they're now successful adults. But at the time, so I want to tell you a little bit about the method. Photo voice was developed in public health. And it was really designed to allow people to, for themselves, identify challenges faced in regard to a specific topic and analyze that situation, come up with potential action steps, and then present those action steps to policymakers. So it's a very defined process that I'm happy to talk a little bit more about in the next slide, but I will acknowledge that I veered from that process a little bit because being outside of public health, my interest was more in how do people understand their own heritage, how do they define it, what interests them, and what might we be able to work on together as an issue of concern. So on this page, you have photographs by, mostly except for the bottom left, taken by the participants in the Photo Voice project. You have a lovely caldo de res, which was explained that it's eaten primarily on special days, tortillas, which is a daily food item, and the weaving of hammocks, which is seen as an important activity and because it supports communities in their own way. People can weave a hammock for a friend, or that can be kept in the community, but they can also support themselves by selling a hammock within or beyond the community. So that was seen as a source of self-support, I'll say. So the actual process of how this worked was the students received cameras, and on the first week, prior to the week listed on the slide, we decided what the first research question would be, or what the focus of the first session would be. And then the students went out with their cameras and took pictures that would respond to the question or prompt, either literally or metaphorically. And so you can see the list of questions they addressed each time. When they came back together as a group, they would choose 2 of their favorite photos from each camera, or each student in this case, and then they would go through them and explain to each other why they had taken the photos, and then select by consensus their voting to focus on for that session. And then there's a series of questions designed by Apello Freire, actually, to go from what is physically in this picture, kind of how does that make me feel? What does it mean? What can we do about it? And like I said, I took a little bit of a broader approach just because of my archaeological kind of side of things, rather than as someone come to specifically provide services. And so in each week we kind of ended up getting into some of the challenges that the community faces, but I learned a lot from this project, and some of it can't really be quantified. Some of it is a little bit more of just getting to know people, getting to know the experience of growing up in this town, but also actually about what the main economic opportunities are there, some of the struggles, and how people are finding solutions to them. So for example, the picture in the middle on the right was a student's picture of someone looking for cell phone service on the top of the mound in the center of town because it was the highest location. And they point out kind of through this discussion how uncomfortable it is to sit there with your arm raised, etc. Now, since this time, many of the problems, not all of them, but many of the challenges discussed have actually been addressed. And this is one of them. There's now self-service as well as the data available for internet connections and many more Wi-Fi opportunities. And finally, I would like to tell you just a little bit about a museum founded in 2015. The end goal was to hopefully house artifacts that were found through excavation, and this is still a work in progress. It requires permission from INA, and it also right now, the museum, it has donated artifacts rather than the excavated artifacts, and it is kind of in progress as well, because right now there's hope to move the museum to a bigger space. And so we're doing some reformulating since the pandemic, as there was a heritage committee that formed in 2015 that was very active until around 2020. And so it's kind of a period of forming anew. There was a heritage trail component to that. I'd be happy to talk about more, but I should get to my research. So let me show you my first LiDAR visualization here. This is the town of Tahcabo. This is you can see the grid established during the colonial period. You can see how my team member, Luke L. Thomas, has outlined the houses and how they relate also to the rejolladas. So here in the center of town, there's a large sinkhole feature. And around, so there's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that you can see in the slide, and also the cenote that opens up like an amphitheater into the ground. And there's another cave-like cenote over here. So in the past, we've done research into sinkholes, and I'm just going to give you a couple of insights from that, but I really wanted to stress that these gardens are really important to town residents, and a lot of people in the town depend on farming, so it's one component of a larger system. And so it ended up working well in terms of community interest and researcher interest to focus on these areas. From an archaeological standpoint, there's actually enough soil here to potentially look at change in agriculture over time, which in the surrounding areas generally is not the case, where there may only be 30 centimeters of soil over bedrock. And so one of the exciting finds from this was for potential evidence of an ancient agricultural feature dating to more than 3,000 years ago. And then a second quick point to cover was evidence for intensive use of these features around AD 100 to 400. Not going to get into it right now, and that's published. I can refer you to it, but the point is that there was cotton being cultivated in these features. There was maize, a wide variety of useful trees. And I think the other thing I wanted to point out was just that there are a lot of artifacts from that time period. And when I'm looking at the colonial period, I don't have anything parallel. So I think there are ways that we can get inspiration from the past that might be applicable to contemporary challenges. So let me talk about my current project. So previously, the research that I had conducted as part of the project focused on the town of Tahcabo itself. And now I'm also working in areas that are controlled by the town's ejido, a term I'll explain shortly, and to the farmland of the town. In this image, I'm showing an example of one rejollada that's kind of got specialty of production happening today. So brief rundown of the ejido system. The ejido system came out of land reform after the Mexican Revolution. It really was a response to more than a century of these this push of people off their land, the calling, this issue of what I said, how there's all this forest-free growth stage from the agricultural system. Sometimes when land was fallow, it was kind of claimed to be unused land and taken away. There was definitely a promotion of private business over common agricultural land. And so land pressure grew and grew. And that was addressed after the Mexican Revolution, when communities could petition for land through the system. And then the land called the ejido that they had received from the federal government would be governed by a council of ejidatarios and a president and secretary. So this land was held by communities who petitioned for it, and it was inherited through decades and decades. And then there was this constitutional reform in Mexico in the 1990s that allowed communities to start to privatize these lands. And the idea was this is a neoliberal reform that would encourage farmers to take up other occupations. And then the large kind of conglomerates or farming corporations would have more land to do their work. So it really was meant to kind of undo some of this original land reform from the Mexican Revolution. However, people have not sold land in the quantities expected, and a lot of people continue to farm to the extent that it kind of surprises policymakers. And in Tahcabo, as mentioned, I'm doing work on the ejido now with my team, and with community members support as well. And they began a process of privatization, but they don't have fully alienable land titles. They have forest reserves, but people continue to want to farm, and then people from outside can lease the land, and then they lose access to that. So some more of the forest reserves, there's interest in creating more farmland from that. So it's just a time of flux. And our hope is that through this project, we will be able to support community decision-making by offering information, perspectives, and fostering dialogue about past and present agricultural adaptations to climate change as we see them, and convene interest groups, convene groups of interested parties, I suppose, in order to come up with adaptation pathways that make sense amidst climate change, without saying that that's our job, right? So to the extent that we're welcome and invited to participate in those conversations. So one way that we're doing this, I already showed you one visualization of the LiDAR data. So we have gotten funding from National Geographic Society to collect LiDAR data for the ejido. That has been done. And Luke L. Thomas has been working on the visualizations. He will also be creating from those data, not just the surface model, but also a model of the canopy height and biomass for the forest reserves there. And so the hope is that that will be helpful to community members as they visualize and understand their forest reserves, and maybe as they choose which ones to parcel out to farming. And we also hope that the ground level visualizations that we're working on will be useful to them. So this is something I'm working on. I'm currently part of the NEH Institute called Networking Archaeology and Communities, Archaeological Data and Communities. And so this has been really helpful. They're teaching me all about important principles of data management. And I believe in Canada, these principles have been discussed to a great extent. I think maybe more so than in the United States. I think that the CARE principles are incredibly relevant here. So I'm working in a community where many people speak Yucatec Mayan language. Not everyone says that they're Indigenous. Some people would say, like, I'm a Maya speaker and maybe identify as Indigenous in that way. And then there's, of course, maybe not of course, but there's people from all over Mexico who live there because people move and come in and out of town. So there is this idea that care principles should be used in only context of indigenous data governance. And I think it is sufficiently relevant here. And so some of the principles have to do with community self-determination for data, their ability to control rights to the data and its accessibility and their accessibility. And the idea that data should be linked to respectful relationships made in person. And also that people should have the data literacy necessary to be able to manipulate, or you know what I mean by manipulate, I hope. Let me rephrase that. The ability to use or to, let's just say, visualize data in ways that are helpful to them. So here is a more spelled out version. So I think this is something I would love to see taken on for LiDAR. I think that there are so many pitfalls working with these data sets that are very detailed. They are large files, and we're working with the community. I think they should have control of these, and that's something that I'm still designing. I think that there's room for growth for our project here. I think there's room for growth in the field in this area. And so if you're interested in this, I hope we can talk more. All right, so other methods that we're using in this project include interviews with farmers about their experience farming amid climate changes, what those climate changes have looked like to them. And this is actually a very vibrant discussion happening right now, because a lot of the president's programs, Andrés Manuel López Obrador's programs in Mexico, do address climate change. And so these farmers are in many cases receiving plants that they've never grown in the area before to test out and see if they'll work. So they're also getting trainings regularly about what climate change is and how that can be managed. So we're not the only ones by any means working on this topic right now. And so the ethnographic component of this project is being led by Miguel Cancho Cumo, who was an UNO graduate a few years back. And so we also take field visits. I'm not going to reflect too much right now on the results of those interviews to date, but look out for that. And then, of course, this is an archaeological project. We have to be working on the past. So as I mentioned briefly, the hope in this study is to find what people were doing in the past amid climate change. Of course, not anthropogenic climate change like we're seeing right now, but there were periods of drought in the past. What were people doing on this landscape? And trying to generate some ideas that will help in brainstorming ways forward. I will acknowledge we learned a lot about the importance of cattle ranching today, and so there might not always be a direct one-to-one correspondence of what we're learning about the past and today, but I think what will be interesting is to understand both how we got to this point through the colonial period and how sinkholes in particular and nearby areas were used in earlier times that are diverse and beyond perhaps our current imagination. So looking at relationships between climate, sinkholes, settlement patterns, which we're getting at through the LiDAR and ground truthing of LiDAR, which was my Springfield season, biodiversity and cultivation. So you probably want to know a little bit about how we're doing that. We got cores as shown in this picture in the town cenote. So we have Ivan Batunalpuche standing in this picture. Isaac Hart from the University of Utah was helping with the coring, and so he is advising me in this picture. And so we have cores from the town cenote and then excavation of 3 additional rejolladas from the ejido. And the idea, let me skip ahead. The idea with the excavation units here is that I want to be able to hopefully understand more localized signatures for both climate and agriculture. And so we've got samples for the soil carbon isotopes, which should help to identify periods of intensified maize agriculture. In the cores in the cenote, we're going to be looking also at the carbon and oxygen isotopes to work on climate reconstruction. And what I was hoping, there are rejolladas that are kind of in between. They're a little bit deeper, they're swampier, sometimes they hold deep water. And my hope was to also core those. And we were in the Yucatan in a really dry period, and it wasn't possible. So that's kind of to be determined whether that would be feasible, because I would love to be able to track localized climate patterns, and as well as the pollen from those same locations, which is something that's currently undergoing study in order to see what was growing through those different climate changes. And so these aren't surprising techniques. These are techniques that archaeologists have used in the past, and we hope they'll work for us. I think the real challenge here is to be able to see the past at a scale, at a resolution where you can understand the decisions people are making based on climate, especially when I say climate might mean that it was a particular, like the rain came at the wrong time of year, or some of these kinds of realities that people face today that aren't necessarily as likely to show up in isotopes. So I think that by putting kind of the focus of the research on the community accountability, on trying to find a research topic that's relevant to community issues today. We're also going to drive forward the way that we do archaeology in an optimistic sense. I would like to see the technology meet the need here in the context of community engaged research. So as I mentioned briefly, I currently have pollen identification happening. John Jones is working on that. We have some radiocarbon dates, and the isotopes, Dr. Liz Webb is working on those up in Canada at Western University. And so I was just going to mention really quickly that so far we have a couple of interesting pointers in terms of what direction we're going, which has to do with the dating that we have, that we have a couple of good contexts for the late post-classic period to the present day. And so as my previous research focused on the colonial period, we may also start there with this project to be able to track the pollen pollen patterns, just like in a little bit more detail, and alongside not just the climate records we get from the cenote and the other climate studies that have been done, but also historical documents showing times of drought and how that affected people. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And I'd be happy to discuss a little bit more for anyone interested about kind of the way we understand how people might be moving across the landscape in times of drought. But I think that provides a pretty good understanding of where the project is. And I also dwelled a little bit more on areas of the research that I thought might be more relevant to what you all are working on as well. So I will stop there and thank all these wonderful people who worked with me on this project. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, Maya. That was wonderful, a very thorough and really in-depth overview of all the ways that your research is touching elements of both outreach and decolonization and really innovative methods that you and your team are using. So it's really impressive. So thank you so much for really starting off our year really strong for really innovative ways to approach archaeology and how archaeology can be useful. Because like the turn, I think in terms of all the theory we learn and the way theory is going is like the relevance of archaeology to now is probably I think where most of the things are going. So your project really speaks to that. I'm going to jump right in with a question because I was really curious to hear about the way that communities are responding to all the work that you're doing and trying to understand these phases of drought and potentially maybe kind of deleterious climatic effects. What are people dealing with now in terms of short and long-term trends, and how do you think the data that, like the preliminary data that you have and any long-term data, might contribute to planning ahead, or even questions around sustainability, kind of quote unquote learning from the past in terms of the evidence that you're uncovering? How have you found that those conversations been happening?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Would you like me to stop sharing at this point, or is it okay?
Yeah, you can take the screen down and we can just chat amongst ourselves. That's great.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for that question. So some of the initial conversations that we've had through these interviews, which we're still transcribing, coding, and kind of in the thick of, but definitely what came through is that yes, the rains have changed. There's less rain now than there was in the past. And actually that was part of the inspiration to do this project, was even in having interviews in a previous project about gardens and sinkholes. People were bringing up this problem that yields are not as high as they used to be. And so that continued to be something that we heard, and it's attributed to soil health, and it's also attributed to climatic change and specifically drought. So people don't notice so much changes in temperature here. It's more a matter of when is the rain coming, how much are we getting, and is it coming primarily in storms? So to answer this question, like it's coming later. So the rainy season used to start in May, and when we were doing these interviews in the summer of 2022, the rainy season started at the end of July. So there's that change. And then the quantity is understood to be less or experienced as less, but it could be that it's coming in other time. Research has shown that there's not so much less, but it's the timing of it isn't corresponding as well, and that more of it is coming in storms. So, and then other things that people would bring up aren't necessarily as directly tied to climate change. So for one example, the Maia train project is being constructed south of this community, going through Valladolid where the university is. And so that is actually a lot of environmental change, and animals are fleeing from the area and coming up to eat the produce in their fields, because they now have a more limited scope of where they can go. So that was of note that season. Another kind of just like adding examples to your answer here. One really cool thing about Rejolladas is that they were known in ancient times as places where cacao could be cultivated. And Yucatan is otherwise too dry. Now there are ways to make it work. So there are in Yucatan cacao groves that are not in these sinkholes. But a lot of work has been done recently to show through soil chemistry that cacao grew in specific features in the past. And there were relic stands of cacao that botanists have taken to nearby states where there are like INIFAP stations or agricultural stations to grow out. And so those could potentially be reintroduced. So because my data set is relatively preliminary, I can't say much yet, although the last slide that I had to breeze through, I did not show you, was about, like, my hope is that next summer will really be dedicated and reserved for the conversation of like, okay, so questions of data literacy and what can this data set do for you, and where should it be used and not be used, et cetera. And here are preliminary data from pollen, from any climate reconstructions, and is this useful for a conversation? Where I was previously at Cornell University for a postdoc, where there was an agricultural school, so drawing on connections of, even to non-archaeologists, and saying, okay, well, there's specialists in sustainability and cattle raising, and like, can we bring in other experts who, even though it's not related to the necessarily the research on how land use worked in the past, could still be eminently helpful.
That's really fascinating. I think it's funny how we kind of reimagine archaeology too, like something where it's studying the past for the past's sake, but also to the way that it can be useful for populations now, right? And I think that should oftentimes be the starting point for archaeological projects, right? And that in the 21st century, I think it should be. So your work is a really wonderful example of that. So thank you so much for sharing all that. I'll pass it to my colleagues to ask any other questions, or if there's any questions online, but thanks again, Maia.
Yeah, thank you. One thing you just made me think of too, one thing I didn't address is, some of us do lab-based research where we're working with collections that have already been collected in the field. I think that's also can be very ethical research. So I don't want to downplay, some of the statements I'm making, I really had fieldwork in mind. So I want to acknowledge that.
I completely agree. I think going back to legacy collections and museums and stuff that people hadn't had a chance to fully analyze should also be an avenue for sure. Yeah, I don't know if Patricia, you wanted to add anything else from your. Yeah, I don't know with your research and agriculture and
Yeah, this was your talk was amazing, and I think I share a lot of thoughts with you. In terms of communities, I would like to ask you something. The first thing is, how many years have you been working with community engaged? So how many years of interviews and activities with them? And if you have seen changes in the way that communities show or perceive researchers, because one of the things that I noticed when I'm in the field is as we go as researchers to do an investigation, and we came from university, and we know that university it has this we could say this colonialism thought. So sometimes they show you as the people who know everything. So for me, it's sometimes challenging when I ask questions to them, because they think that the people who knows the things are me. And for me, what I'm trying to say to them is, no, I would like what you know, because it's more valuable that I know. So that's I would like to know, how do you experience these things in your project?
Thank you very much for two really rich questions. So as far as the years of collaboration, I was part of the team in our initial kind of go around the peninsula in 2012. And so we did short field seasons the summers of 2013, 2014. In 2015, 2016 and 2017, I was actually able to be there most of the year, or at least like the majority of the year. So it was helpful to have that time. And one thing that I had meant to spend more time saying was how time consuming this work is. I think it can depend too what kind of social organizations are involved, NGOs, how a town kind of functions in that way, how large they're dealing with a town or a city, of course. There's a lot of variables here. For us, because we're working in a town, I don't think I even said this, but maybe around 600 people, so very small. For me, most valuable interactions are one-on-one. Technically, the town comisario, there's two, there's the town and the ejido comisarios. They are the people to whom I'm ultimately accountable, like in a kind of legal framework, or in a even kind of expectations locally. But that doesn't mean you have community buy-in. I mean, at some point, if enough community members are against it, then you're gonna find out, and the community leaders presumably will ask you to leave or not do the work. But I found that just because I said something to one person didn't mean someone else was going to know it. Maybe that's obvious, but it is a lot of house to house to house kind of like face engagement, but also hosting a number of activities and going to a number of activities. So accepting any invitation is an opportunity to get to know people better. And really to just enjoy life, because sometimes they're wonderful kinds of events. But I would say we've had workshops. We offered Yucatec Mayan language workshops, because as I mentioned, that was a skill set that the students brought. So many of the students at UNO are kind of being trained as teachers. And so they are able to lead those kinds of a week-long summer workshop for kids, because there's concern in the community in language loss. other things are, we were lucky enough to have Dr. Gabriel Vale come and do a Madrid Codex workshop for each of the schools. So the primary school, middle school, and then the high school, the adults were also invited to. And then they did Dr. Vale did a teacher training in Tisimin. So just things like this where it's kind of, where is the interest? In that case, the Madrid Codex was likely scribed nearby. So it seemed like a great opportunity to explore those connections. And then your other question was about changing perception of researchers. And that is a wonderful question. I need to reflect more on it. I think that I agree with you. I find that a lot of people upon, especially upon getting to know each other, it's like, you're the expert, there's the respect for education, formal education. But of course, yeah, we also have similar conversations of, we believe that you're the expert. So, but I think, there's something to be said for, we're each coming together with our knowledge set, and can they be complementary, so that also it's not just asking for information. I hope that it's an exchange, just because that is a better kind of relationship, I suppose. And so sometimes I feel like I needed to do my homework to be able to bring something useful to the table. And that's puts me on a better footing to have those conversations. I would say that there's a person I can think of in mind. It's a small town, who's always going to be suspicious of an outside researcher. And I'm not going to change that. And I think there's a lot of people who are going to have their perceptions change their time. I think that's, most people. And I think that, sometimes I would even say, I imagine I've done something that might have annoyed someone. And therefore, their mind may have changed. And then hopefully I find that out and I can go and correct the situation and get back into good shape and good relationship there. I could give one really easy example, which is I accidentally, and this is kind of silly as a paleoethnobotanist, but I trampled someone's bean plants without realizing. And so I luckily was told, so-and-so is very upset with you, and was able to work on that relationship. So I think that we can count ourselves very fortunate when we're given the opportunity to correct mistakes as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is something that all archaeologists and all people or researchers that work in agricultural practice that are still alive needs to thought to be more engaged with people, because they are really important to know more things, right? I have another question. I don't know if I could ask. In terms of your research how do you track the land practices, so the change in the land practices? So using some kind of, I don't know, phytolith analysis or another kind of microrest, or yes.
Yeah. Could you clarify? Do you mean change short term or into the deep past?
Or I mean in the past. So if you have tracked, for example, maybe that was a moment that there were a burning episode, for example, or some kind of fertilization way, this kind of things. Yes,
excellent question. This is a challenge. So I mentioned that one reason why I work in sinkholes and rejolladas is because that's where the soil exists. That doesn't mean the soil is perfectly arranged and lovely stratigraphy. And in fact, what I found is that, so my strength in research has been macrobotanical studies, but unfortunately in rejolladas, the water, this kind of, wet, dry seasons that happen there, and then the water flow into these features is so great that I find very rarely that there's ancient carbonized material preserved. And when it is, it's usually because it was covered by a feature that includes rocks, or there's some kind of protecting layer. So that's not really an option. But phytoliths would be the question, and pollen is what we've primarily used before. I think phytoliths would be wonderful. It's a technique that I'm in the early stages of learning, and I'd rather probably entrust that to someone with more knowledge. So all of these can be expensive specialist studies to be able to pursue. But then you really have to ask yourself, so what am I seeing? Am I seeing this in a chronological order? And so we continue to take radiocarbon dates, even though there's some concern that you're not seeing what should be seen. And I think that's ends up being why a focus on the more recent pasts is easier. So even when I worked on residences for the colonial period, then I could find these carbonized plant remains around the houses, whereas we weren't necessarily seeing any carbonized remains preserved from more ancient times. So it is a constant struggle to know what we're looking at, when it dates to, and then to find what it was. And that's where I'm hoping, that the techniques can match the question, hopefully.
Thank you. Thank
you. Anyone else have any other questions? I don't know if we have any online questions either. Let me see.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, thank you for this amazing talk. It has been very interesting. And I was just had some questions about the photo voice method you have used to gather information regarding heritage. And I wanted to know if you have find any trends or have had the opportunity to compare how the community has the community understanding regarding heritage, if it has fluctuated or if it has been stable over time. And the second question was, where do you go from there? What are you planning to do with that information that you gathered with the photo voice data?
Great, thank you so much. For photo voice and what we learned about heritage, so it was really neat to see all the different photos that students came back with in simple kind of, the simple prompt being, why is it wonderful to grow up in Tahcabo? What are heritage places and things of importance to you? Because some of the pictures that came up were even coin collection, which I hadn't really thought of. The embroidery that I showed of the horse, so practice craft today. What came up, the carne de res, the soup picture, that actually is tied to the Saints' Day celebration, and a lot of our conversations, not just in photo voice, but in general, have come back to that particular event that is celebrated in the week leading up to August 24th for St. Bartholomew. So a lot of community heritage is practiced in that. So I think what's helpful is we also I put up on the side, we went to Ekbalam, an archaeological site, and had their kind of reflections on that. Some of those conversations, the construction of the church in town, which I guess I showed pictures of without introducing that to you, but the colonial church ruins and how some of the stones were harvested from a nearby pre-Hispanic structure. So there's a lot of reflection on that as well, but I think what was helpful was to pair that with more, I don't know if colloquial is the right term, but just like how people think of what matters in terms of identity related to the material past. Caves came up a lot as places that are important to people and to their past. And then but I think you also asked a question about how those conceptions have changed, and I would love to look into that more. As I mentioned, that was 2014. Here we are, 9 years later, working on a project related to heritage. Have our contributions led to changes in that regard? Have other things going on in the world changed how people are thinking of it? I would say some things are stable very intentionally, like that same stay precision. I believe, it doesn't stay the same to the extent that it does on accident. People are trying and working hard on that. And other things probably did fluctuate more. We did end up incorporating coins into the museum exhibit, donated coins, and so some of the ideas about what heritage is worked their way into the exhibit. And I think where to go from here? I think that, like I mentioned, the museum's in flux. I think that some of the excavated artifacts, like a coin from 1776, like some of these little things, even projectile points from the colonial period, could be need to have on display, but there needs to be a community organization, registered community organization willing to petition for that, to maintain those artifacts in the town. And so it's just, right now it's kind of like, that takes a lot of effort, and is there the community volunteer hours there to really support it? And so I don't have a definite answer for you on the second question, but thank you for it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I think we'll take enough of your time. Taken enough of your time, Maia. Thank you so much for a really wonderful keynote address. I hope to see you in person if you're able to make it for our workshop, to pop in to see if you can make it up to Vancouver. But if not, another opportunity, hopefully at the SAAs. So we can say bye to everyone on Facebook Live. Have a great day and a great weekend.